Do you ever have one of those weeks where you're just trying to water your plants and mind your own business, and suddenly you're in the middle of a neighborhood mess you never asked for? Yeah, that was me. It started with a cactus, a smug HOA president, and a whole lot of rules that didn't make any damn sense. What happened next? Well, I'm still unpacking it. If you've ever had to deal with HOA drama or just power-hungry folks with clipboards, drop a comment. You're watching QA Stories, and this one goes places. My name is Richard Miller, but everyone calls me Rich. I'm 50 years old, recently retired from my career as an internal investigator, and all I wanted was to spend my golden years tending to my cactus garden and reading history books in peace. I bought a beautiful house in what seemed like the perfect neighborhood in Arizona. Nice lawns, friendly neighbors, and, best of all, a backyard that got perfect sunlight for my prized cactus collection. I should have known that peace was too good to last. The trouble started the day after I moved in, when I met Evelyn Sterling. Everyone called her Evie, but I quickly learned that the sweet nickname was about as genuine as a $3 bill. She was 55, a former lawyer who'd recently been elected as the new HOA chairman. She looked past me like she was casing the place, her smile never touching her eyes. I'm not even sure why, but the moment she introduced herself at my front door, I got this uncomfortable feeling in my gut. Looking back, I should have trusted that instinct. Evie wasted no time making her presence known. Within days, I got fined for my cactus, for my podcast, for my dad's chess set. Apparently, my cactus garden was visually threatening to neighbors and needed to be removed immediately. I actually had to read that twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Visually threatening? We're talking about plants here, not attack dogs. But when I called the HOA office to ask for clarification, Evie's assistant just repeated the same phrase like she was reading from a script. I wish I could tell you I kept my cool during that phone call, but come on, who wouldn't snap at something that ridiculous? The harassment didn't stop there. 2 days later, I got another violation for listening to history podcasts in my backyard. According to the notice, my audio entertainment was disturbing the peaceful environment of the neighborhood. I actually went outside to test this theory, and you literally had to stand right next to my patio chair to hear anything. But apparently, Evie had been patrolling the area and decided that my quiet enjoyment of a documentary about World War II was somehow a community menace. At this point, I was starting to wonder if I'd accidentally moved into some kind of authoritarian compound. The final straw came when she forced me to remove my handmade chess set from my patio. It was a handmade chess set from my late father. She dismissed it as recreational clutter. When I tried to explain the sentimental value, she just shrugged and said, rules were rules. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about maintaining property values or community standards. This was personal. I had faced armed criminals during my investigation career, people who'd stolen millions from their companies and had everything to lose. But I'd never encountered someone who would fine cactus plants for having threatening sharp angles. The pettiness was so extreme it was almost impressive. I started keeping a folder of all the violation notices, partly for my own records and partly because I couldn't quite believe they were real. The fines were piling up fast, and I was honestly ready to just pack up and move somewhere else rather than deal with this level of insanity. But then I remembered something my son Brendan had told me during his last visit home. He'd said that bullies only have power if you let them have it, and that sometimes the only way to stop escalation is to face it head on. I wasn't sure if that philosophy applied to HOA disputes, but I was running out of options. So I did what any reasonable father would do. I called my son and asked for help. Can you come home for a few days? I need help with something. What I didn't know was that calling my son would completely change the game. I had no idea that Brendan's training had taught him to approach problems systematically, to gather evidence before acting, and to never underestimate an opponent. I definitely didn't know that Evie's harassment was just the tip of the iceberg, or that my quiet little neighborhood dispute was about to uncover secrets that would shock our entire community. All I knew was that I needed backup, and my son was the only person I trusted to help me figure out what to do next. I didn't know that calling him would make things much worse, or if it would make them much better. Brendan arrived 3 days later, and I have to say, even after all these years, I still feel a surge of pride when I see him in person. He's 28 now, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever life throws at you. He's a Navy SEAL, which means he's seen and done things I can't even imagine, but he's still my kid. When he hugged me at the airport, I felt this wave of relief that I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. Maybe it was just having family around, or maybe it was knowing that someone finally believed my situation was worth taking seriously. The first thing Brendan did was listen. Not just polite listening, but the kind of focused attention that made me feel like every detail mattered. I walked him through the entire timeline of events, from my first meeting with Evie to the latest round of violation notices. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer immediate solutions, and didn't dismiss anything as trivial. When I finished explaining about the chess set violation, he just nodded and said, "Let me observe the situation first, Dad. Then we'll decide how to handle this." I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed that he wasn't immediately ready to march over to Evie's house and demand answers. What happened next surprised me. Instead of confronting anyone or making phone calls, Brendan spent the next day quietly installing a full surveillance system. No details spared. When I asked him about it, he just said it was always good to have documentation. I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time, but I trusted his judgment. After all, he'd been trained to assess threats and respond appropriately, which was more than I could say for myself. Watching him work was like watching a detective solve a case before the crime had even been committed. The second thing he did was read every bylaw and amendment, cover to cover. He spread all the paperwork across our dining room table and went through it line by line, making notes and highlighting sections. He'd pause occasionally to ask me questions about specific incidents, but mostly he just absorbed information. "Dad," he said after several hours, "some of these violations don't match the actual rules. She's making stuff up as she goes." I wish I could say that revelation made me feel better, but it actually made me more nervous. If Evie was willing to fabricate violations, what else might she be willing to do? I started second-guessing my decision to escalate the situation. Maybe I should have just paid the fines and kept my head down. But when I mentioned this to Brendan, he gave me this look that reminded me exactly why I'd raised him to stand up for what was right. "You didn't start this fight, Dad," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean you should let someone walk all over you." That's when Evie made her first mistake. She must have noticed Brendan's presence in the neighborhood, because she immediately began targeting him too. First, she complained about his morning PT workouts, claiming that his exercise routine was disruptive to the peaceful morning atmosphere. I actually laughed when I read that violation notice. Disruptive? The man does stretches at 6 in the morning. But apparently, Evie had decided that physical fitness was somehow incompatible with community living. The fine was $300, and the notice specifically mentioned that military-style training was not appropriate for residential areas. Next, she criticized his help with my garden maintenance. Since arriving, Brendan had been helping me replant some of the cacti that had been damaged by the constant inspections and rule changes. He'd also helped me clean up the patio area and organize my outdoor furniture. Our yard never looked better. But she fined him anyway, for helping me. According to Evie's latest interpretation of the rules, having family members assist with property maintenance required prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The final straw came when she organized an emergency HOA meeting to discuss concerns about the Miller family's impact on community harmony. She'd turned neighbors against us. I felt humiliated and furious. I couldn't believe she was actually trying to turn our neighbors against us, but apparently she'd been going door to door spreading rumors about our aggressive behavior and disregard for community standards. When I saw the meeting notice, I felt this mixture of anger and embarrassment that I hadn't experienced since high school. Were people really going to believe that a retired investigator and his Navy SEAL son were somehow threatening the neighborhood's safety? But Brendan just smiled when he read the notice. "Perfect," he said. "She's giving us exactly what we need." I didn't understand what he meant, but I was starting to trust his strategic thinking. He'd been observing Evie's behavior for days, taking notes and recording everything. When I asked him what his plan was, he just said, "Evidence is always stronger than accusations, Dad. We're going to let her make her case, and then we're going to show everyone what's really going on here." The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, which gave us 5 days to prepare. I spent most of that time feeling anxious and second-guessing everything. Was I being too stubborn? Was I dragging my son into a petty neighborhood dispute that wasn't worth the trouble? But every time I started to doubt myself, I'd remember the look on Evie's face when she dismissed my father's chess set as recreational clutter. Some things are worth fighting for, even if the fight seems small to everyone else. The day before the meeting, something happened that changed everything. Brendan and I had gone out to run some errands, and when we came back, my garden was gone, smashed. The cacti I'd nurtured for years destroyed. Plants that had taken me years to cultivate were chopped up and thrown in the trash. The beautiful arrangement I'd spent months planning was nothing but dirt and broken pottery. I stood there, staring at the destruction, feeling this hollow ache in my chest that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just about the plants. It was about feeling powerless in my own home. But when I looked over at Brendan, I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before. His jaw was clenched and his hands were balled into fists. For a moment, I wondered if this was the moment my son would finally lose his cool. But then he took a deep breath and walked over to check his security cameras. He checked the footage. "I think we've got everything we need for Thursday." His voice was flat, controlled. I wasn't sure what he meant, but something in his tone made me think that Evie had just made the biggest mistake of her life. I kept going out to the backyard, hoping I was wrong, hoping the cacti were still there. These weren't just plants to me. They were living things I'd nurtured and cared for, some of them for over 10 years. The barrel cactus in the center had been with me since my first apartment after college. Now, it was just broken pieces in a trash bag, and I felt this overwhelming sense of violation that I couldn't shake. I wasn't even sure if I was more angry or just heartbroken. But Brendan seemed strangely calm about the whole thing. While I was pacing around the house trying to figure out what to do next, he was reviewing footage from his security cameras. He watched the footage in silence, not blinking. Every now and then, he'd pause the video and make notes. When I asked him what he was seeing, he just said, "More than I expected, Dad. A lot more than I expected." The way he said it made me think there was something he wasn't telling me, but I trusted him enough to let him work through whatever he was discovering. The next morning, Brendan sat me down and explained what the cameras had recorded. Not only had they captured the destruction of my garden, but they'd also caught something far more serious. While we were out running errands, Evie had used her master key to enter our house. She'd spent nearly 15 minutes inside, and the cameras had recorded her planting a bag behind one of the couch cushions. "Dad," Brendan said quietly, "I think she's trying to frame you for something, and I think Thursday's meeting is when she's planning to make her move." I actually had to sit down when he told me this. Someone had opened my front door without permission, entered my private space, and planted evidence to incriminate me. The violation was so extreme that I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. I'd seen embezzlers, con men, but never someone planting drugs in a neighbor's home. He showed me the footage on his laptop, and there was no room for doubt. The cameras had recorded everything in crystal clear high definition. There was Evie, using her master key to unlock our front door like she owned the place. There she was, walking through our living room and planting a bag. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes, but it was clearly premeditated. She knew exactly what she was doing, and where she wanted to put whatever she was planting. I wasn't angry at that point. I was just numb. The reality of what I was seeing was so far outside my normal experience that my brain couldn't quite process it. This wasn't just harassment or petty rule enforcement. This was breaking and entering, trespassing, and planting evidence. These were serious crimes that could send someone to prison, and she was doing it to me, a retired investigator who'd never caused problems for anyone, just because I'd voted against her election and refused to be intimidated by her violations. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But Brendan was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Instead of confronting Evie immediately or calling the police, he wanted to wait until Thursday's meeting to reveal the evidence. If we act now, she'll spin it. Let her try it in public first, then we strike. I wasn't sure about this strategy. Every instinct told me to confront her immediately, to demand answers, to call the police and let them handle it. But Brendan's military training had taught him to think strategically, to consider timing and positioning and psychological impact. "Evidence is always stronger than accusations, Dad," he said, repeating something he'd told me before. "We're going to let her hang herself with her own rope, and then we're going to show everyone in that meeting exactly what kind of person they elected to lead their community." The next few days were some of the most stressful of my life. I felt like I was walking around with this massive secret. Knowing that Evie was planning to destroy my reputation and potentially have me arrested based on evidence she'd planted herself made me feel paranoid and angry all at once. Every time I saw her around the neighborhood, I had to fight the urge to say something. She'd wave and smile like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just committed multiple felonies against me. I started wondering if I was being paranoid, if maybe I was overreacting to what might have been some innocent explanation for her behavior. But then I'd remember the footage, and I'd remember that there was no innocent explanation for entering someone's home without permission and planting evidence. The security system he'd installed captured everything in multiple angles, so there was no chance of someone claiming the footage was doctored or unclear. The timestamps matched perfectly with the receipt from the hardware store where we'd been shopping, proving we were nowhere near the house when the break-in occurred. And the bag she'd planted was still exactly where she'd left it, untouched and ready to be discovered whenever she decided to make her move. We had everything we needed to prove her guilt, but we also had to let her commit to her plan before we could expose it. 2 days before the meeting, I discovered what was in the bag. Inside was a small stash of marijuana, enough to justify a call to the cops. A perfect trap. Apparently, Evie's plan was to accuse me of drug use, have the police search my house, and then watch as they discovered the evidence she'd planted. It was brilliant in its simplicity, and it probably would have worked if she hadn't been dealing with someone who'd installed professional surveillance equipment. The meeting was hours away. Brendan was calm. I was anything but. I kept thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the possible arguments Evie might make, all the neighbors who might not believe the evidence even when they saw it. But I also kept thinking about my father's chess set, about my destroyed cactus garden, about the look on Evie's face when she'd dismissed my concerns like they didn't matter. The community center was full, every seat taken, whispers filled the room. I'd never seen so many neighbors in one place before, and it seemed like everyone wanted to see what was going to happen. As Brendan and I walked in, I felt dozens of eyes watching us, some sympathetic, some suspicious, all curious. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my palms were sweating. This was it, the moment that would determine whether my reputation in this community would survive or be destroyed by whatever Evie had planned. We took seats in the back row, partly because they were the only ones available, and partly because Brendan wanted to be able to see everyone's reactions to whatever was about to unfold. He'd brought his laptop and a small projector, equipment that looked innocent enough, but that I knew contained evidence that would shock everyone in that room. As we waited for the meeting to start, I found myself studying the faces around me, wondering who would believe us and who would side with Evie. I recognized most of these people from around the neighborhood, but I had no idea what they really thought about our situation. She walked in like she owned the place, suit sharp, folder in hand. She nodded to various neighbors as she walked to the front of the room, playing the role of the concerned community leader perfectly. If I hadn't seen the security footage myself, I might have been fooled by her performance. She had this way of projecting authority and competence that made you want to trust her judgment, even when your gut was telling you something was wrong. The meeting started with routine business, budget updates, maintenance schedules, the usual HOA bureaucracy that nobody really cared about. But I could feel the tension building in the room as everyone waited for the main event. Finally, after about 20 minutes of procedural discussions, Evie cleared her throat and addressed the room with the tone of someone delivering grave news. "I'm afraid I have some very serious concerns to share with all of you tonight," she began, and I felt my heart rate spike. She painted us as threats, hiding behind smiles, criminals in a quiet neighborhood. According to her version of events, our family had been escalating the situation with each interaction, and she'd finally discovered evidence of illegal drug use on our property. The way she told it, we were practically running a criminal enterprise out of our house, and she was the brave community leader who'd risked her safety to expose us. Then came the moment I'd been dreading. Evie announced that she'd conducted a routine safety inspection of our property the previous day and had discovered what appeared to be illegal substances in our living room. She claimed she'd had no choice but to document the evidence and call for a police investigation. The room erupted in shocked murmurs, and I felt those eyes turning to look at us again. I wanted to stand up and shout the truth, to tell everyone that she was lying, but Brendan put a steady hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Not yet, Dad. Let her finish." The performance was masterful, I have to admit. Evie managed to sound both disappointed and concerned, like she was genuinely sad to have discovered such disturbing information about neighbors she'd tried to work with. She called for an immediate police investigation and suggested that our family should be suspended from all HOA activities, pending the outcome of the criminal charges. Several neighbors were nodding along with her presentation, and I felt this sinking feeling in my stomach as I realized how convincing she sounded to people who didn't know the truth. But then Brendan stood up, and the room fell silent. There was something about his presence, the way he carried himself, the calm confidence in his voice, that commanded attention. He stood up, calm. "I'd like to present our side. Just facts. His voice was steady and respectful, but there was an undertone of authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. Even Evie seemed momentarily thrown off by his composure. She tried to maintain control of the situation, arguing that this wasn't the appropriate time for rebuttals and that the evidence spoke for itself. But several neighbors called out that they wanted to hear our side of the story, and eventually she had no choice but to allow Brendan to speak. He walked to the front of the room and began setting up his laptop and projector, moving with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of presentation before. "I'd like to show everyone what actually happened yesterday," he said simply. And I felt this surge of pride watching him take control of the situation. The first image that appeared on the screen was a timestamp from our security system, showing the exact time that Evie had claimed to conduct her routine safety inspection. Then came the footage itself, crystal clear high-definition video of Evie using her master key to unlock our front door and enter our house without permission. The room was dead silent as everyone watched her plant the bag behind our couch cushions. The footage captured every detail: her checking to make sure the bag was properly hidden, her satisfied expression as she surveyed her work, even her careful movements to avoid disturbing anything else in the room. When the video ended, the silence in the room was deafening. People were staring at the screen in complete disbelief, then looking at Evie, then back at the screen. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The room turned on her. The confident, authoritative woman who'd been leading the meeting just minutes before had been replaced by someone who looked like she'd been caught in the worst possible lie. Several neighbors were shaking their heads in disgust, and I heard someone near the front of the room mutter, "I can't believe she actually did that." Finally, Evie managed to stammer out some kind of defense, claiming that she'd been conducting a routine safety inspection and that the video must have been doctored or taken out of context. But her explanation sounded weak and desperate, especially after what everyone had just witnessed. Brendan calmly responded that the footage was time-stamped and that we had receipts proving we were at a hardware store during the time of the break-in. He also pointed out that using a master key without homeowner permission or emergency justification was breaking and entering. Regardless of her position in the HOA, the room erupted in angry voices, with neighbors demanding explanations and calling for Evie's immediate resignation. I felt this overwhelming sense of relief washing over me as I realized that the truth had finally come out. The people who'd been ready to believe her accusations were now seeing her for what she really was, someone who'd been willing to break the law to frame an innocent neighbor. Several people who'd seemed skeptical of us earlier were now approaching to apologize and express their support. Honestly, what would you do at this point? Would you feel satisfied with just exposing her, or would you want to dig deeper into why she was so desperate? But even as I felt vindicated, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still didn't add up. This level of desperation, there had to be more. As I watched Evie's face crumble in front of the entire community, I realized that we'd only scratched the surface of something much darker. There had to be more to this story, something that would explain why she'd been so desperate to maintain control over our community. The evidence was overwhelming and her lies had been exposed. But the question remained, why would someone go to such extreme lengths over a neighborhood dispute? The answer, I suspected, was still waiting to be discovered. Neighbors came by with food and apologies. Stories poured out. We weren't the only targets. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than I'd thought possible, and by the next morning, people were stopping by our house to express their support. It was like the whole community had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to finally expose what everyone had suspected, but no one had been willing to say. The relief was palpable, but so was the anger. People were furious that they'd been deceived by someone they'd trusted to lead their community. But the victory came with complications I hadn't anticipated. Evie wasn't done. Her attorney claimed we'd violated her rights by recording her. Within 48 hours, she'd hired an expensive lawyer who immediately began making noise about illegal surveillance, entrapment, and violation of privacy rights. The lawyer sent us a formal letter claiming that our security cameras had been installed without proper notice and that recording someone without consent was a criminal act. I actually laughed when I read that. She breaks into my house to plant evidence, and somehow we're the ones who committed crimes by recording it? The lawyer's accusations made me second-guess everything for a while. I started wondering if we'd somehow crossed a legal line by recording her without her knowledge, if the evidence we'd gathered would be inadmissible in court, if her expensive legal team would find some technicality that would let her escape consequences. "The whole neighborhood is talking about us now," I told Brendan one evening as we sat on the patio where my cactus garden used to be. Was I the one who'd gone too far? Maybe we should just accept that she's been exposed and let the legal system handle the rest. But Brendan had that look in his eyes that told me he was thinking several steps ahead. I don't like conflict, Dad, he said quietly, but I hate being falsely accused even more. And I really hate watching someone try to destroy my father's reputation with lies and planted evidence. He'd been spending his days reviewing HOA documents and financial records, and I could tell he was discovering things that troubled him. When I asked what he was finding, he just shook his head and said, "Let me make sure I understand what I'm looking at before I say anything. But Dad, I think her harassment of you was about more than just power and control." That's when Brendan began his deeper investigation into Evie's background and the HOA's financial records. As a former investigator myself, I should have thought to look into these things earlier, but I'd been so focused on the immediate harassment that I hadn't considered the bigger picture. Brendan followed the money, a paper trail of fake invoices and missing funds. What he found was a pattern of suspicious activity that went far beyond petty rule enforcement. The financial records showed irregularities that would have been red flags to anyone with investigative training. There were invoices for landscaping projects that had never been completed, contracts with construction companies that didn't seem to exist, and maintenance expenses that far exceeded what should have been necessary for our small community. Money was flowing out of the HOA accounts at an alarming rate, but it wasn't clear where it was actually going. When Brendan showed me the numbers, I felt that familiar investigative instinct kicking in. These weren't accounting errors. They were deliberate attempts to hide financial fraud. We spent the next week building a comprehensive case that went far beyond the break-in incident. Brendan had contacted some of his military buddies who specialized in financial investigations, and they'd helped him trace the money trail. Thousands. Stolen. A year-long embezzlement scheme under the HOA's nose. The amount wasn't huge by corporate standards, but it was significant enough to represent serious criminal activity. The evidence was overwhelming, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why risk everything for so little? Unless she feared what we'd find. Why would a former lawyer, someone who understood the legal consequences of financial fraud, engage in such obvious criminal activity? And why had she been so desperate to get rid of me specifically? I wasn't a threat to her scheme. I was just a retiree who wanted to garden in peace. Unless she thought I might notice something that others hadn't. The realization hit me like a physical blow. All the harassment, all the petty violations, all the escalating intimidation, it hadn't been personal. It had been strategic. She knew my history. She saw a threat. She'd seen my background as an investigator and decided I was a danger that needed to be eliminated before I could discover what she was really doing. So she'd tried to discredit me, to make me seem like a troublemaker who couldn't be trusted, to force me to leave the community before I could cause problems for her. When that hadn't worked, she'd escalated to framing me for drug possession, hoping to destroy my credibility permanently. I had heard similar stories before on forums and discussion groups, people who seemed petty and vindictive on the surface, but were actually hiding much bigger secrets. The kind of stories where the harassment was really about silencing someone who might expose a larger crime. I'd never thought I'd be living one of those stories myself. 1 week after the showdown, we gathered again. This time, Brendan presented the financial evidence. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Thousands of dollars in community funds had been systematically stolen over the past year. Brendan traced the money. The room fell silent. The room was silent as neighbors absorbed the magnitude of what they were hearing. This wasn't just about harassment or violation of privacy. This was theft from every homeowner in the community. The money that should have been used for maintenance, improvements, and community services had been diverted to fund whatever Evie had been planning. People who'd been initially sympathetic to her claims of being unfairly targeted now understood that they'd been victimized as well. But even as we presented the evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still missing something important. The financial fraud was serious, but it didn't explain the level of desperation in Evie's behavior. She'd been willing to risk everything, her career, her freedom, her reputation, just to maintain control over our small community. The fraud explained her actions, but not her desperation. Not yet. As the meeting ended and neighbors began discussing next steps, one woman raised her hand and asked the question that had been haunting me. But why would she steal from us? Why risk everything over some money she could have earned legitimately? The room fell silent as everyone considered this question. I looked at Brendan, and I could see in his expression that he was thinking the same thing I was. The stolen money wasn't the end of the story. It was just another piece of a puzzle that we hadn't fully solved yet. From my window, I saw the officers cuff her and walk her out, calm, final. Evie was arrested 3 days later on charges of breaking and entering, trespassing, and embezzlement. Relief tugged at me, but so did something heavier. Pity for a life unraveled. Part of me was relieved that justice was finally being served, but another part of me felt sorry for someone who'd thrown away her entire life over what seemed like such a relatively small amount of money. She'd been a lawyer, a professional with a good reputation, and she'd destroyed it all for what amounted to a few $1,000s in HOA funds. But even from jail, Evie continued to fight back. They claimed we'd committed crimes by recording the woman who broke into our home. Her lawyer was sending threatening letters almost daily, claiming that we'd violated her rights and that she was the victim of a conspiracy. The letters were full of legal jargon and accusations that made my head spin, but Brendan just filed them away with the calm efficiency of someone who dealt with desperate people before. "Dad," he said one morning as he sorted through the latest batch of legal threats, "desperate people make mistakes, and when they make mistakes, they reveal things they didn't mean to reveal." That's when we noticed something odd about the lawyer's letterhead. The firm was called Henderson and Associates, which wasn't unusual in itself, but something about the name bothered me. I'd heard it before, but I couldn't place where. Brendan hadn't stopped. Each night, more files, more threads. Something was still off. More importantly, he found a news article from 5 years ago about a case called Henderson versus Sterling and Associates. And Sterling was Evie's maiden name before she'd married and divorced. Brendan found the article. 5 years ago, Henderson was convicted thanks to Evie. The article was about a lawyer named Robert Henderson who'd been convicted of embezzling money from his law firm's client accounts. According to the story, Henderson had been stealing money over a period of several years, and the fraud had only been discovered when one of his partners, Evelyn Sterling, had noticed irregularities in the accounting. Sterling had been praised for her integrity and professional courage in exposing the crime, and Henderson had been sentenced to 5 years in prison. It seemed like a straightforward case of professional misconduct, but something about the timeline bothered me. I spent the next day researching everything I could find about the Henderson case, and the more I read, the more suspicious it became. The evidence against Henderson had been largely circumstantial, and his defense had claimed that he was being framed by someone else in the firm. At the time, these claims had been dismissed as desperate attempts to avoid responsibility. But now I was wondering if there might have been more to the story. The pattern of financial irregularities was remarkably similar to what we'd discovered in our HOA records, and the timing coincided with Evie's move to our community. Brendan contacted Henderson's family and discovered that Robert Henderson had maintained his innocence throughout his imprisonment and had died in prison just 2 years ago. His daughter, Sarah, agreed to meet with us and share her father's case files. She stood in our doorway, gripping a box like it weighed far more than paper. "He never stopped believing that the truth would come out," she told us, tears in her eyes. "He said that Evelyn Sterling had destroyed his life and he was determined to prove it. Her father had been right all along. Evie was the thief, and he died trying to prove it. Henderson had been systematically investigating Evie's activities for years, and he'd uncovered evidence that she had been the one embezzling money from their law firm. The fake invoices, the shell companies, the creative accounting, it was all there, documented in meticulous detail. But more importantly, he'd discovered that Evie had been using her position as a partner to cover up her crimes and systematically frame him for her own misconduct. The evidence was compelling, but it had never been presented in court because Henderson's lawyer had been inexperienced and overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. But the most shocking revelation came when Brendan traced the money trail from our HOA funds. It wasn't greed, it was insurance. Money meant to silence the man she'd buried. The account had been established shortly after Henderson's conviction, and it had been steadily growing ever since. The stolen HOA funds weren't about personal gain, they were about fear. Evie hadn't been stealing money for personal gain. She'd been accumulating a fund that she could use to buy Henderson's silence if he ever managed to prove his innocence or expose her crimes. The money was insurance, a way to ensure that her past would never catch up with her, and our small community had been unknowingly funding her guilty conscience, paying for her desperate attempt to keep her secret buried forever. But Henderson was gone, so why keep stealing? What was she still afraid of? The answer came when Brendan discovered that Henderson's daughter had been continuing her father's investigation and had recently made contact with federal investigators who were reviewing his case. Evie must have found out about this development and realized that her past was about to catch up with her regardless of how much money she'd accumulated. That's when her behavior suddenly made perfect sense. She hadn't been targeting me because of my cactus garden or my vote against her election. She'd been targeting me because she'd seen my background as an investigator and panicked. She'd been terrified that I would notice the financial irregularities, that I would ask the right questions, that I would expose her crimes before she could figure out how to deal with the Henderson family's investigation. Every violation notice, every fine, every escalating act of harassment had been motivated by the fear that I would discover what she was really doing. The harassment had been about buying time. She'd been desperately trying to force me out of the community before I could cause problems for her, and when that hadn't worked, she'd escalated to framing me for drug possession. If she could destroy my credibility and get me arrested, she could discredit anything I might say about her financial activities. It was a desperate plan, but it might have worked if she hadn't been dealing with someone who'd trained his son to think strategically and gather evidence before acting. As we prepared to present this new evidence to the authorities, I couldn't help but think about how many people's lives had been destroyed by Evie's desperation to cover up her crimes. Henderson had died in prison, convicted of crimes he didn't commit. His family had been devastated by his conviction and had spent years trying to clear his name. Our entire community had been victimized by her theft and manipulation, and all of it could have been avoided if she'd just accepted responsibility for her actions years ago. Brendan handed over the records. The feds didn't need convincing. They reopened the investigation into Henderson's conviction and began building a case that would not only expose Evie's recent crimes, but also vindicate a man who died believing that the truth would never come out. It was the kind of justice that felt both satisfying and heartbreaking. Satisfying because the truth was finally being revealed. Heartbreaking because it had taken so long to emerge. But as I watched Brendan organize the evidence and prepare for the final legal proceedings, I had this nagging feeling that we were still missing something important. The money trail was clear, the pattern of fraud was undeniable, but there was something about Evie's desperation that still didn't fully make sense. She'd risked everything to stay in control, and I still didn't know what exactly she was protecting. The truth was about to come out, and I had this sinking feeling that once I knew what Evie was really running from, I'd understand why she fought so hard to keep control, and why she was so terrified of losing it. The tapes didn't lie. Evie had framed him, deliberately, methodically, over years. Sarah Henderson had been going through her father's personal papers when she discovered a safety deposit box that he'd mentioned in his prison letters, but that she'd never been able to locate. When she finally gained access to it, she found something that changed everything we thought we knew about Evie's crimes. The box contained audio recordings that her father had made during his time at the law firm, conversations he'd secretly recorded because he'd suspected that someone was setting him up. The recordings were damning beyond anything we'd imagined. They captured Evie systematically framing Henderson for her own crimes, manipulating evidence, and coordinating with accomplices to ensure that he would be convicted. But more importantly, they revealed the true scope of her embezzlement. The money she'd stolen from their law firm wasn't just a few $1,000s. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars that had been diverted from client accounts over a period of several years. Henderson had been investigating massive financial fraud, and Evie had framed him to prevent her exposure. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As federal investigators dug deeper into Evie's background, they discovered that Henderson wasn't her first victim. She'd buried reputations like bodies, anyone who got too close. The pattern was always the same. Evie would identify someone who posed a threat to her activities, she would find a way to discredit them, and she would use her legal knowledge to ensure that they couldn't fight back effectively. The HOA money hadn't just been about accumulating hush money for Henderson. It had been about building a fund that she could use to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. Every dollar stolen wasn't just fraud, it fueled the machinery that kept her past buried. And our small community had been unknowingly funding her criminal enterprise, paying for her ability to destroy lives and avoid consequences. She wasn't a petty tyrant, she was a predator hiding behind bylaws. This wasn't just about financial fraud or even framing an innocent man. This was about a systematic pattern of destroying people's lives to protect her own interests. The woman who'd been finding my cactus plants and harassing me about my chess set had been operating a criminal enterprise that had victimized dozens of people over the years. The federal case against Evie was overwhelming. Between the audio recordings, the financial evidence, and the testimony of numerous victims, there was no possibility of her escaping justice this time. She was charged with multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The charges carried a potential sentence of 20 to 30 years in federal prison, and given the scope of her crimes, there was little chance of her receiving a lenient sentence. But what struck me most about the final court proceedings was how ordinary she looked sitting in the defendant's chair. She'd ruled the neighborhood with rules and fines. Now she sat, silent in orange, while victims spoke. It was hard to reconcile the image of the confident, authoritative HOA chairman with the criminal who'd been exposed in federal court. I kept thinking about how she'd smiled and waved at neighbors while secretly planning to frame me for drug possession, and I wondered how many other people she'd fooled over the years. The sentencing hearing was more emotional than I'd expected. Victim after victim took the stand to describe how Evie's crimes had affected their lives. Henderson's daughter spoke about her father's death in prison and the years her family had spent trying to clear his name. Former colleagues described how she'd systematically undermined their careers and destroyed their reputations. Even some of our neighbors testified about the emotional toll of living under her harassment and manipulation. When it was my turn to speak, I found myself thinking about all the people who'd been affected by her crime. I thought she was just cruel about cactus gardens. I didn't realize she was destroying lives, I said. I thought I was dealing with a petty tyrant who was abusing her position in our homeowners association. I had no idea that I was actually dealing with someone who'd been destroying lives for years. The harassment I experienced was nothing compared to what she did to Robert Henderson and his family, but it was part of the same pattern of behavior. She used her position and her legal knowledge to intimidate and silence anyone who threatened her criminal activities. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, the charges stacked like bricks. 25 years, no early release. The sentence was longer than I'd expected, but given the scope of her crimes and the number of lives she'd destroyed, it seemed appropriate. As she was led away in handcuffs, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief that justice had finally been served. But the real victory wasn't just about punishment, it was about vindication. Robert Henderson's name was cleared, officially, publicly, finally. His family received substantial compensation for the injustice they'd suffered, and his reputation was fully restored. The federal investigation had exposed a network of corruption that extended far beyond our small community, and several other criminals were brought to justice as a result of the evidence that had been uncovered. Our community began the long process of healing and rebuilding. The HOA was gone. The community chose clarity over fear. The stolen money was recovered and returned to the community fund. My cactus garden was replanted with help from neighbors who'd initially been skeptical of my story, but who now understood what had really been happening. Even the chess set came back out to the patio where it belonged. The experience changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I'd retired thinking that my days of fighting injustice were behind me, but I'd discovered that sometimes the right fight finds you whether you're looking for it or not. I'd also learned that having a Navy SEAL for a son was about more than just having backup in a crisis. It was about having someone who understood the importance of gathering evidence, thinking strategically, and never giving up when the truth was on your side. Life returned to normal, but it was a better normal than what I'd had before. My new cactus garden thrived in the sunshine, and I could tend to it without worrying about violation notices or harassment. The HOA operated with complete transparency, and neighbors actually looked forward to meetings instead of dreading them. And every morning, I watched Brendan work out in the yard during his visits home, knowing that some battles are worth fighting, especially when you have the right person on your side. The whole experience taught me that evil often disguises itself as bureaucracy, that corruption can hide behind official positions and legal procedures, but it also taught me that the truth has a way of emerging when people are brave enough to stand up for what's right. Evie thought she could use her master key to control everyone around her, but she never expected that my son had a different kind of key, the key to justice. And once that door was opened, there was no closing it again. Looking back, I realized that the harassment I experienced was just the tip of the iceberg. If I hadn't stood up to her, if I hadn't called Brendan for help, if we hadn't gathered evidence and fought back strategically, she might have continued her criminal activities indefinitely. How many more lives would she have destroyed? How many more people would have been framed or silenced? Sometimes the biggest victories come from the smallest acts of courage, and I'm proud that we were able to stop her before she could cause more damage. The neighborhood is quiet now, but it's real peace, not the fake peace that comes from everyone being too scared to speak up. Children play in the yards without fear. Neighbors actually talk to each other instead of avoiding contact, and the HOA serves the community instead of terrorizing it. When I sit on my patio in the evenings, listening to my history podcasts and admiring my cactus garden, I feel this deep sense of satisfaction that comes from knowing we did the right thing. We did the right thing, Brendan said. And for the first time, I believed it. So yeah, she thought a few fines and a fake bag of weed could bury me. But when you've spent your life digging out the truth and your son's trained to dismantle lies for breakfast, you don't go down easy. And watching her face when the footage played, I don't care what anyone says, that was justice. Real, sweaty palm, neighbor-staring justice. I guess what I'm saying is, don't underestimate quiet people, especially the ones with cameras and receipts. If this story hit a nerve, or you've been through HOA nonsense of your own, hit like, share it, or leave a comment. And if you want to toss a few bucks to help keep stories like this coming, the little thanks buttons down there, no pressure. I'm just glad y'all stuck around. See y'all next time on QA Stories.
Appreciate you sticking with us at QA Stories. Hit that bell so you never miss a moment, because things only get crazier from here.